Chapter 48. Will led the way, slipping around the rock buttress and into the narrow entrance to the cave system. The others waited for him outside the entrance. After several minutes, he reappeared, beckoning them forward. "The first chamber is empty," he reported. "I can hear them in the inner chamber. Sounds like they're chanting." Halt waved him forward. "Lead the way." Will disappeared into the narrow slit in the rock face once more. Halt followed, giving him a few seconds to get ahead, then Horace started after him. Before he entered the cave, Malcolm laid a hand on his arm to stop him. "Horace," he said, "this might help if you feel a little panicky." He handed the warrior a small canvas packet. Horace opened it and looked at the contents, puzzled. It appeared to be a small pile of rotten bark, covered in some kind of greenish fungus. He sniffed it experimentally. It was decidedly earthy to smell. "It's moss, mixed with a kind of fungus," Malcolm explained. "It occurs naturally on trees throughout the north, but it glows in the dark. It'll give you a little light. Just enough for you to get your bearings, but not enough to be seen further down the tunnel. Just unwrap it if you need it." "Thanks, Malcolm," Horace told him, and, turning sideways, he squeezed his way through the narrow entry to the tunnel. He was a good deal larger than Halt and Will, and it took a little effort for him to force his way through. He had to draw in his chest and hold his breath, but finally he made it. For the first few meters, there was enough light from the entrance to keep him oriented. But after the tunnel began to twist and turn, it became darker, and he felt the old familiar sense of panic as he imagined the blackness around him squeezing in on him. In his mind, the darkness was a solid thing, like the rock itself, and he began to fantasize that it was crushing him, holding him in a gradually tightening vice so that he couldn't breathe. His heart began to race as he stared around him, seeing nothing. His chest was tightening, and then he realized that, in his nervousness, he had actually neglected to breathe. He drew in a deep, shuddering breath. From a few meters away, he heard Malcolm's soft whisper, "Open the packet." Remarkable, Horace thought. The panic had been so complete that he had forgotten the packet Malcolm had given him only a few minutes before. He felt for the cover and flipped it open. A soft green light glowed from the center of the packet. It was dim, but after the total impenetrable blackness, it was more than enough to let him see the rough walls of rock only a few centimeters from his face. Instantly, his breathing eased and he felt his heart rate relax a little. He still wasn't happy about being in a confined space, but it was infinitely better than being in a totally dark, confined space. "What's that?" Halt's voice said out of the darkness ahead of him. Then Horace could make out the dim shape of the ranger's face reflected in the green light. He was only a meter or so away. "Malcolm gave it to me," he explained. He heard Malcolm close up on the other side of him. "It's not bright enough to be seen past the next bend in the tunnel," the healer said. "You're probably right," Halt agreed. "Regular bundle of tricks, aren't you?" But he knew of Horace's aversion to confined dark spaces and realized the small green glowing bundle wasn't posing any risk. "All right, Horace, I'll go ahead. If you hear me click my fingers, it means I can see you coming. Cover it up as soon as you hear it." And with that, he melted away into the darkness again. Horace gave him a few seconds' start and followed on. In spite of his best efforts, his footsteps grated in the sand underfoot, and his belt and scabbard tended to scrape against the rocks at his back. When they reached the first chamber, he decided, He'd take them off and carry them. There would be less chance of their snagging that way. He rounded another outcrop in the rock and realized he could see a dim grey light ahead. He covered the glowing bark and put the package away inside his jacket. The light grew stronger until he emerged into the chamber Will had described. Shafts of light from the late afternoon sun struck through the clefts set high in the walls of the chamber. Horace breathed in deeply. The smaller of the two cabins wasn't the sort of place he would choose to spend time in, but it was a lot less constricting and challenging than the narrow, black tunnel he had just passed through. Will and Halt had moved to the inner wall of the chamber and were crouched, listening. As Malcolm emerged from the tunnel in his turn, he and Horace moved across to stand beside the rangers. Horace could see the small, low-level entrance to the next part of the tunnel. He set his jaw in a tight line. He wasn't going to like going through there, luminous bark or no luminous bark. Will glanced up, saw his pale face, and grinned encouragingly. "All right so far?" he asked. Horace tried to grin in return, but he knew it was a feeble effort. "Loving it." Then Halt hushed them both with an impatient gesture, bending closer to the mouth of the second tunnel. "Listen," he said, and they all gathered more closely around him. They could hear the faintest suggestion of a voice carrying down the tunnel. It was too faint to discern words, but they could hear the rise and fall of the cadence of the speech. Then the sound stopped, and a fraction of a second later, a louder sound could be heard. This time it was recognizable. It was the sound of a large group of voices, responding to that first lone voice. They still couldn't make out the words. The echo created by the twists and turns in the tunnel and the muffling effect of the solid rock itself saw to that. But the enthusiasm and energy behind the response was unmistakable. "Fanatics," Halt said. "Don't you just love them?" He glanced up at Will and jerked his head towards the tunnel. "See what they're up to," he said. Will nodded briefly. He crouched and disappeared into the black mouth of the tunnel. Horace unconsciously felt inside his jacket for the package of luminous bark. Then, remembering his previous thought, he unbuckled his sword, wrapping the belt itself around the scabbard. Halt glanced up at him, saw the action, and nodded. "Good idea," he said. He unslung his quiver from over his shoulder. For a second or two, he debated whether to unstring his bow. It would be easier to carry that way, and less cumbersome in the confined space of the tunnel. But the thought of emerging unarmed at the far end was not one that held any appeal. It was 10 minutes before Will's face reappeared at the entrance. He grinned up at them. "All clear," he said. Then he scrambled out and stood erect. "There's no guard in the tunnel or at the entrance," he told them. "Tennyson has an altar at the far end of the cavern, and all the faithful are in a half circle facing him." "And not the tunnel," Halt said, a satisfied note in his voice. Will nodded. "We'll come out behind them, and at a 45-degree angle to the way they're facing. Nobody will be looking in our direction. Even Tennyson will find it hard to see us. His end of the cavern is lit up by candles, torches, and a large fire. We'll be more or less in darkness. And there are plenty of rocks to provide cover for us." The voices were discernible again as Tennyson began another sequence of question and answer with the crowd. It was all too familiar to Horace, Halt, and Will. They'd heard it before. Malcolm, who had been appraised by them about Tennyson's operating methods, could guess pretty accurately what was being said in the cavern. As Halt had said, it would be a version of "Praise Alcaeus and hand over your money," although, the healer thought with a wry smile, perhaps a little less blatant. "All right," Halt said, "let's get going. Lead the way again, Will. And Horace, the minute you see light at the end of the tunnel, cover up that moss of yours." Horace nodded. Halt bent and disappeared into the low entrance. The tall warrior took several deep breaths, preparing himself. He felt a light touch on his arm. "I'll be right behind you," Malcolm said. "Let me know if you're in trouble." The healer had personal knowledge of Horace's courage, and he knew this fear of dark, confined spaces had nothing to do with physical bravery. It was something locked deep in Horace's mind, perhaps some incident in early childhood that he had long forgotten. Knowing this, he recognized the real courage that Horace was showing in overcoming his fear. "I'll be fine," the young warrior said, his face set in tight lines. Then he relaxed and grinned ruefully. "Well, maybe not fine," he admitted, "but I'll manage." Holding his sword in one hand, he reached into his jacket for the canvas packet, then ducked down and shuffled forward into the tunnel. After the brief period in the dim light of the cavern, the darkness of the tunnel seemed overwhelming once more. He reached up with his scabbarded sword, tracing the roofline above him. Then, as it receded out of reach, he stood slowly erect. Once again, he felt the terrifying sensation of blindness, the feeling that his world had been reduced to his own personal space, with nothing beyond it. The fear that his eyes no longer functioned. His heart began thumping more rapidly once again, and he flipped back the cover on the luminous moss, seeing that wonderful little glow of light nestled in the palm of his hand. Behind him, he heard Malcolm shuffling along the tunnel. Calmed by the little light source, Horace continued down the tunnel, moving with greater assurance now that the darkness wasn't total. He glanced up several times, but the dim glow from the moss wasn't sufficient to reach the ceiling high above him. It was swallowed by the blackness. Rounding another twist in the tunnel, he became aware of a dim grey light ahead. Quickly, he covered the moss and made his way round one last corner of rock. Light seemed to pour in from the large cavern as he approached the end of the tunnel, where Will and Halt crouched, surveying the scene before them. As Will had told them, the cavern was the size of a small cathedral, with a high soaring roof that disappeared into the darkness above it. The far end of the high cavern was a blaze of light, where torches and candles were set in brackets. In the middle of the floor was a vast fireplace, and the leaping flames from this cast shadows on the walls. Beyond the fire, and lit by what appeared to be scores of torches and candles, was an altar. It was the usual outsider's altar, built in gold and silver and decorated with precious gems. Yet, if this one ran true to form, the gold was a thin veneer over wood, and the silver and gems were fake. The real items would be safely stowed in Tennyson's packs. Tennyson was in full flight, arms thrown wide, as he delivered an impassioned appeal to the assembly. "Alcaeus loves you," he intoned. "Alcaeus wants to bring light and joy and happiness into your lives." "Praise Alcaeus!" the congregation cried. "You say the words," Tennyson told them, "but are your hearts sincere? For Alcaeus only hears prayers from those who believe. Do you truly believe?" "Yes!" the crowd replied. Malcolm, his mouth close to Horace's ear, whispered, "More to the point, do people really fall for this claptrap?" Horace nodded. "It never ceases to amaze me how gullible people can be." "There's danger in this land," Tennyson continued. His voice now was full of foreboding. Danger and death and destruction. Who can save you from this danger? Alcaeus! The crowd roared. Tennyson threw his head back now and looked up above them all, into the dark recesses of the ceiling of the cavern. Show us a sign, he asked. Show us a sign, golden Alcaeus, god of light, that you hear the voices of these people before you. Malcolm eased forward a little to get a better view. He had spent years devising signs and manifestations in the depths of Grimsdale Wood. Signs such as the one Tennyson was now asking for from his non-existent god. This ought to be good, he said, to no one in particular.